How to Read Literature Like a Professor, First Edition, by Thomas C. Foster. Chapter 19, Geography Matters. Let's go on vacation. You say okay and then ask your first question, which is, who's paying? Which month? Can we get time off? No, none of those. Where? That's the one. Mountains or beaches, St. Paul or St. Croix, canoeing or sailing, the Mall of America or the National Mall. You know you have to ask because otherwise I might take you to some little trout stream 27 miles from a dirt road when you really want to watch the sun go down from a white sand beach. Writers have to ask that question too, so we readers should consider its implications. In a sense, every story or poem is a vacation, and every writer has to ask, every time, where is this one taking place? For some, it's not that tough. William Faulkner often said he set the majority of his work on his little postage stamp of ground, his fictional Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi. After a few novels, he knew that ground so intimately he didn't even have to think about it anymore. Thomas Hardy did the same thing with his mythic Wessex, the southwest corner of England, Devon and Dorset and Wiltshire. And we feel that those novels and stories couldn't be set anywhere but where they are, that those characters couldn't say the things they say if they were uprooted and planted in, say, Minnesota or Scotland. They'd say different things and perform different acts. Most writers, though, are less tied to one place than Faulkner or Hardy, so they have to give it some thought. And we readers have to give their decision some thought as well. What does it mean to the novel that its landscape is high or low, steep or shallow, flat or sunken? Why did this character die on a mountaintop, that one in the savannah? Why is this poem on the prairie? Why does Auden like limestone so much? What, in other words, does geography mean to a work of literature? Would everything be too much? Okay, not in every work, but frequently. In fact, more often than you think. Just think about the stories that really stay with you, where they would be without geography. The Old Man and the Sea can only take place in the Caribbean, of course, but more particularly in and around Cuba. The place brings with it history, interaction between American and Cuban culture, corruption, poverty, fishing, and, of course, baseball. Any boy and any older man might, I guess, take a raft trip down a river. It could happen. But a boy, Huck Finn, and an older man, the escaped slave Jim, and their raft could only make the story we know as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by being on that particular river, the Mississippi, traveling through that particular landscape and those particular communities at a given moment in history. It matters when they reach Cairo and the Ohio empties into the big river. It matters when they reach the Deep South, because Jim is running away in the worst possible direction. The great threat to a slave was that he might be sold down the river, where things got progressively worse the farther south you went, and he's floating straight into the teeth of the monster. And that's geography? Sure. What else? I don't know. Economics, politics, history? So what's geography then? I usually think of hills, creeks, deserts, beaches, degrees, latitude, stuff like that. Precisely. Geography, hills, etc., stuff, economics, politics, history. Why did Napoleon conquer Russia? Geography. He ran into two forces he couldn't overcome, a ferocious Russian rider, winter, and a people whose toughness and tenacity in defending their homeland matched the merciless elements, and that savagely, like the weather, is a product of the place they come from. It takes a really tough people to overcome not merely one Russian winter, but hundreds of them. Anthony Burgess has a novel about the Russian winter, defeating the French Emperor, Napoleon's Symphony in 1974, in which he brings to life, better than anyone, that geography and that weather, the vastness of it, the emptiness, the hostility to the invading and then retreating troops, the total absence of any possibility of comfort or safety or solace. So, what's geography? Rivers, hills, valleys, buttes, steppes, glaciers, swamps, mountains, prairies, chasms, seas, islands, people. In poetry and fiction, it may be mostly people. Robert Frost routinely objected to being called a nature poet, since by his count he only had 3 or 4 poems without a person in them. Literary geography is typically about humans inhabiting spaces, and at the time the spaces that inhabit humans. Who can say how much of us comes from our physical surroundings? Writers can, at least in their own works, for their own purposes. When Huck meets the Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords, or sees the Duke and the Dauphin tarred and feathered by the townspeople, he sees geography in action. Geography is setting, but it's also, or it can be, psychology, attitude, finance, industry, anything that can place forge in the people who live there. Geography in literature can also be more. It can be revelatory, or virtually any element in the work. Theme, sure. Symbol, no problem. Plot, without a doubt. In Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, the narrator spends the opening pages describing a landscape and a day as bleak as any in literature. We want to get to the titular house, of course, to meet the last appalling members of the Usher clan, but Poe doesn't want us there before he's prepared us. He treats us to a singularly dreary tract of country, to a few rank sedges and white trunks of decayed trees, to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn, so that we're ready for the bleak walls of the house with its vacant eye-like windows and its barely perceptible fissure, zigzagging its way down the wall right down to the sullen waters of the tarn. Never perhaps have landscape and architecture and weather, it's a particularly dingy, merged as neatly with mood and tone to set a story in motion. We are nervous and dismayed by this description even before anything has happened, so of course when things do begin happening, when we meet Roderick Usher, one of the creepiest characters to ever grace the pages of a story, he can't give us the creeps because we already have them, but he sure can make them worse. And he does. Actually, the scariest thing Poe could do to us is put a perfectly normal human specimen in that setting, where no one could remain safe. And that's one thing landscape and place, geography, can do for a story. Geography can also define or develop character. Take the case of two contemporary novels. In Barbara Kingsolver's Bean Trees, 1988, the main character and narrator reaches late adolescence in rural Kentucky and realizes she has no options in that world. That condition is more than social, it grows out of the land. Living is hard in tobacco country, where the soil yields poor crops and hardly anyone makes much of a go of things, where the horizon is always short, blocked by mountains. The narrator feels her figurative horizons are also circumscribed by what seems like local certainties. Early pregnancy and unsatisfactory marriage to a man who will probably die young. She decides to get away, driving a 1955 Volkswagen to Tucson. On her way, she changes her name from Marietta, or Missy, to Taylor Greer. As you know by now, there's rebirth when renaming, right? Out west, she meets new people, encounters a completely alien but inviting landscape, becomes the de facto mother of a 3-year-old Native American girl she calls Turtle, and finds herself involved with the shelter movement for Central American refugees. She wouldn't have done any of those things in the claustrophobic old Pittman, Kentucky. What she discovers in the West are big horizons, clear air, brilliant sunshine, and open possibilities. She goes, in other words, from a closed to an open environment, and she seizes the opportunities for growth and development. Another character in another novel might find the heat oppressive, the sun destructive, and space vacant, but she wouldn't be Taylor Greer. In Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, Milkman Dead grows up without ever learning who he really is until he leaves his Michigan home and travels back to the family home country in eastern Pennsylvania and Virginia. In the hills and hollows, not unlike the ones Taylor Greer must flee to breathe, he finds a sense of roots, a sense of responsibility and justice, a capacity for atonement, and a generosity of spirit he never knew before. He loses nearly everything of his associated with the modern world in the process. Chevrolet, fine clothes, watch, shoes, but they prove to be the currency with which he buys his real worth. At one point, direct contact with the earth, he's sitting on the ground and leaning back against a tree, provides him with an intuition that saves his life. He responds just in time to ward off a murderous attack. He could have done none of those things had he stayed in his familiar geography. Only by leaving home and traveling to his real home can he find his real self. It's not too much to say, I think, that geography can be character. Take Tim O'Brien's Vietnam masterpiece, Going After Kakiado, And the main character, Paul Berlin, admits that the American soldiers don't really know the land, don't understand what they're up against, and it's a forbidding place, dry or wet, but always hot, full of full of microbe-filled water and leeches the size of snakes, rice paddies in mountains, and shell craters, and tunnels. Tunnels turn the land itself into an enemy, since the land hides the Viet Cong's fighters only to deliver them virtually anywhere, producing surprise attacks and sudden death. The resulting terror gives the land a face of menace in the minds of the young Americans. When one of their number is killed by a sniper, they order the destruction of the nearby village, then sit on a hill and watch as shell after shell, alternating high explosives and incendiary white phosphorus, pulverize the village. A cockroach couldn't survive. Why did they do it? It isn't a military target, only a village. Did the bullet come from the village? Not exactly, although the shooter was either a VC's villager or a soldier sheltered by the village. Is he still there? No, the place is deserted when they look for revenge. You could make the claim that they go after the community of people who house the enemy, and certainly there's an element of that. But the real target is the physical village as a place, as a center of mystery and threat, as an alien environment, as generic home of potential enemies and uncertain friends. The squad pours its fear and anger at the land into this one small representative piece of it. If they can't overcome the larger geography, they can at least express their rage against the smaller. Geography can also, and frequently does, play a quite a specific plot role in literary work. In E.M. Forster's early novels, English tourists find ways of making mischief, usually unwittingly and not always comically, when they travel to the Mediterranean. In A Room with a View, 1908, for instance, Lucy Honeychurch travels to Florence, where she sheds much of her racially inherited stiffness while losing her heart to George Emerson, the free-thinking son of an elderly radical. She finds what looks like a scandal only to ultimately discover freedom, and a big part of that freedom stems from the passionate, fiery nature of the Italian city. Much of the comedy in the novel grows out of Lucy's battle to reconcile what she knows is right and what she feels to be right for her. Nor is she alone in her struggles. Most of the other characters stumble into awkwardness of one sort or another. Forster's later masterpiece, A Passage to India, focuses on other types of mayhem growing from English misbehavior as the rulers of India and from very confused feelings that beset recent arrivals on the subcontinent. Even our best intentions, he seems to suggest, can have disastrous consequences in an alien environment. Half a century after Forster's lightweight comedies of Folly in Italy, Lawrence Durrell reveals an entire culture of libertines and spies in his beautiful tetralogy, the Alexandria Quartet. His northern European characters displaced to Egypt exhibit every sort of kink, sexual and otherwise, from the old sailor with a glass eye and a predilection for young boys, to the incestuous Ludwig and Lisa Purse Warden, to nearly everyone's inability to be faithful to a spouse or lover. Darley, the narrator of the first and fourth volumes, tells us that there are at least 5 genders, although he leaves specifying them to our imaginations. In Alexandria, then, he shows them to us at full throttle. What are you talking? One might suppose that the heat of an Egyptian summer would induce some lassitude in these already overheated northerners, but there's little evidence of that. Evidently, an Englishman released from the perpetual rain and fog is nearly unstoppable. Yo, what the hell? What separates the sexual behavior of Forster's characters from that of Durrell's, aside from time, is D.H. Lawrence. His works culminating in the overwrought and infamous, if not always successful, Lady Chatterley's Lover, opened the way for more sexual directness. Like many modern writers, he sent his characters south in search of trouble, but curiously, that trouble was not typically sexual, since he, being quite advanced, could get his people in sexual trouble right in the midst of inhabited Britain. Instead, when his travelers find sunshine in the south, they also encounter curious and sometimes dangerous political and philosophical ideas. Crypto-fascism in Australia in Kangaroo, 1923. Psychosexual male bonding in Aaron's Rod, 1922. The return of the old Mexican blood blood religion in The Plumed Serpent, 1926. Desire and power in his little novella The Woman Who Rode Away,